Uh, Today I'm interviewing Ms. Florence Philpott. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Ms. Philpott, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your early background.
Well, I was born in 1909 in Hamilton, Ontario, into a very large family. My father was a clergyman in Hamilton, and I was the 12th of 13 children. I was preceded by 8 brothers, so I was badly spoiled by those 8 brothers. And this is significant as to how I got into social work, because I didn't want to go into social work. I wanted to be a veterinary surgeon. That was my ambition.
How did you make the transition in thought?
Well, I had a brother who was a surgeon, one of my older brothers, and when he heard that I wanted to be a veterinary surgeon, he said to my father, "Don't let her. That's only the roughest kind of men would go in for that kind of a career." So I was very disappointed, and so it seemed to me the next thing that women did in those days was go into teaching. So I went to Northwestern University College of Education.
In Indiana?
In Evanston, Illinois. Yeah. And while I was doing my field work there, my field work in teaching was at a nursery school in Hull House. And I had the great honor of being there, and as all students did in those days, once a year you had lunch with the famous Jane Addams.
Mm-hmm.
And she was then quite an old lady, but it was really something. But her influence on me was great, and I decided when I got through my course at the College of Education that I wanted to work with children, probably, but not in the traditional teaching role, but in this broader community agency such as Hull House.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what happened when you came back to Canada?
Well, I came back to Canada, and somebody said to me, "Why don't you go to the Children's Aid Society in Toronto? I'm sure that with your background in teaching that you could get a job there." So I went and I saw the outstanding director there of, I think his name was Frank Mills, who was the executive director of the Children's Aid Society then, and he gave me very good advice. He said to me, "Now, Florence Philpott, you're very young, and I could give you a job tomorrow, but you should go down to the school," it was then called Social Science Department of the university, "and get your professional training, because that's, if you want to make a career in the field of social welfare, get your training."
Mm-hmm.
So I went down to the School of Social Work and registered and went to the Department of Social Science for the 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a recollection about the kinds of courses that you had?
I was the luckiest person in Canada, because at that time we had Professor Erwick was the director of that school, and to have been under the leadership of Professor Erwick was an experience that I wouldn't give up for anything else. He was a philosopher. I remember his whole theory, philosophy of social work was to bring the good life to as many people as possible. He had a wonderful staff. He had a community organization person there by the name of, from Scotland, and her name was Roberta Hamilton. And Roberta Hamilton was really my advisor throughout my 2 years at school. And after my first year, she said, "Now, I don't think that you really are cut out for the traditional group work, casework. I think you should get into administration. And so I've got a wonderful field placement for you."
Mm-hmm. Where did you do your field placement?
It's in Hamilton. And she said, "I'm going to arrange for you to go with the person, to go and work in the Imperial Cosmos cotton mill as a factory worker. And while you're there, you will then discover how the factory worker spends her leisure time. And I've arranged that I'll have a costume all ready for you on Monday morning up there. You find a place to live, And so I went up to Hamilton and picked up this parcel, and it was a little dust cap to put on my head, and a long blue and white striped dress, and an apron on top of that. And on the Monday morning, I went to the Imperial Cosmos Mill and started to work as a factory worker.
You're doing, was it sewing? What kind of
No,
work
I
was it?
was, my first job was to grease and clean the bobbins, and real factory job. Well, you know, it was very interesting because at my first lunch, the girl who was my teacher, I was a learner, we were sitting having lunch together, and she looked at me and she said, "What university do you go to?" And I said, "What makes you think I go to a university?" She said, "Well, I'll tell you, there are two reasons." She said, "First of all, we haven't employed any new employees here for years. There are no jobs in this place. And secondly, if you could have seen the expression on your face this morning as you started to dig out that grease out of that bobbin, it was clear that you were not really looking for a factory job."
So was that job an eye-opener for you?
It was an eye-opener because I had to be there every morning at 7 o'clock and work till 4, and I did not learn how they spent their leisure time. By the time 4 o'clock came along, I was so dead tired, I went back to my room, fell in bed, sound asleep, and came back the next day. But what I did learn was a healthy respect for the factory worker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how they survived the tremendous pressure under which they worked. And they were great gals. They were really very great gals. And I decided then I'd like to work with people who were in the factories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your advisor, Miss Hamilton, I believe her name was, she had recommended this as a placement in administration. How did this reconcile with what you were learning in school?
Well, I'm not sure she worried too much about how it reconciled. It was really that she saw this as a broadening experience to get to know a whole other group, because my other field work took me into day nursery. And also I had to link this up to the other things I was learning from the other professors that I was under. They weren't called professors, they were the teachers. And again, I was lucky, because the teachers then were Mr. Mills from the Children's Aid Society, Frank Stapleford from the Family Service Association, and there was another wonderful woman, I think she was on the staff of the Family Welfare, either that or the Children's Aid, and her name was Jewel Driscoll. She was a beautiful woman who always had super clothes, and I always appreciated pretty clothes. And she used to come someday, I remember her coming one day and she had a corsage on, and we said, "Well, where are you going?" She said, "I'm going out to visit my clients." And some clients, and we said, "Well, why would you dress like that?" She said, "Because I'm visiting families down in Moss Park this afternoon, and they never see anything beautiful."
Mm.
So those people, that was a generation who had a great respect for human dignity, and who saw these very sensitive things. It was really a very, very exciting group of people to study under.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Cassidy taught me economics. That wasn't beautiful, but it was really good. He was great.
Yeah,
Right. So that was my background at the school. And my other field work, of course, was here with the family division of the public welfare department for my second year placement.
And was that, how did that kind of experience fit with what you learned in the factory, for example, in Hamilton?
Oh, I think it fit into a lot in that you saw the conditions under which people lived, and you saw the difference between the people who were working and the people who weren't, because when you were with the family welfare, you were working with the people who were unemployed and who were trying to make do on those terrible substandard relief rates, which were deplorable. Whereas with the people in the factory, you saw another interesting phenomenon. All the girls and the women that were working there were working because their husbands had been laid off, but all the employers were holding on to the women employees, which happens, of course, in a major depression. The men lose their jobs and the women keep them.
Why was that?
I expect it's because they worked for less. I mean, there's not been that much change over the years. The women worked for lower rates, but and they carried the lion's share of taking care of the home too, as well as working in the factory.
When you finished your education, you came out with a diploma in social services. What was your first job after that?
Well, I went there. My first job was to go to the East End Day Nursery in Hamilton, where we was a daycare center for the children of working parents.
And you were there for a couple of years and then moved on to Montreal.
Yeah, I moved out. I left that job because I got the whooping cough.
From one of the kids?
From one of the kids, and then in order to keep the place open, I had to get out because they couldn't open it as long as there was anybody living in the building. And so the only solution was that the president said I could come and have whooping cough at her house for the 6 weeks, and I wouldn't do that, so I left.
I want to ask you a question about that. You said that you couldn't live there. Why?
No. Because I had a little apartment, you see, there was the nursery on the first floor, and on the second floor there was a very attractive little apartment, which was mine. But I couldn't stay there as long as I had whooping cough.
I just wondered if living on the premises was part of the job.
Yes, yes. I think I worked for $50 a month plus my room and board.
And was the nursery today a nursery is something that runs from 9 to 12 or 1 to 4?
Oh, no, it was a daycare center. These children came in before 8 in the morning, and their parents, usually the mother came and picked them up between 5 and 6.
Okay, I just wanted to get an understanding of what that was. How did it happen that you went to Montreal?
Well, I came from Hamilton. I moved to Toronto to the YWCA, and then from the YWCA, I don't know how I got to Montreal, except I got a letter from Gwyn Howell asking me, after I'd been with the Y for several years, if I'd come down as a supervisor in their South District.
What was Montreal like? What was your work like in those days?
Oh, well, it was very exciting. I worked in a very interesting district. It was called the South District. It was down near St. Antoine. And of course, that was in the midst of the Depression. And the people lived in dire poverty, really disgraceful poverty. And then later, I took on what they called the Public Relations Department, which was a polite name for saying taking care of the people who were called unemployable. And they really were not unemployable at all. There just wasn't jobs, because when the war broke out, within 48 hours, all those people in the unemployable group got jobs in war factories, and their whole life changed overnight.
How was it that with a title like Director of Public Relations or Public Relations Secretary, you were dealing with the unemployables?
Because they didn't want to call them unemployable, so it was just a Public Relations Department. It was a nothing name for that department, except that we did a lot of interesting things. We put on cooking classes for them to help them learn how to live on their substandard allowances. Anyway, I don't know why they gave it that name, Public Relations, but that was what it was called.
During the time that you were in Montreal, did you have much to do with the professional association?
Very much.
What was the association like?
I was more active in the association in Montreal than I had ever been, either in Hamilton or Ottawa or Toronto, actually. The association was then first beginning to get involved in deciding whether their job was really just to give service and go about their business, or whether it was to be social action. And the profession was split down the middle on it. And I must say that I joined forces with the group who felt that, and I think we were the majority, felt that our role was a dual role, and it was up to us to get the community concerned about what was happening, to be really spokesman for people who couldn't speak for themselves, to urge and give strength to the client groups to go out and work for better standards and for their own rights.
What was the position of those of your colleagues who would oppose that point of view? Why were social workers against social action?
Well, some of them, I think, felt that They had gone in this to help the people, to give an individual service, and that we shouldn't get all mixed up in political action.
Mhm.
I think you'll find that's the same thing now, isn't it? I mean, it's not all that different. I think there are a lot of people who feel they would prefer to stick with doing the day-to-day, highly skilled practice of social work.
Mhm.
And the others of us moved on, like myself, to social action programs through welfare councils, social planning councils, and through the professional association.
Mhm. I'm seeing a difference, though, between the position that an individual person would take and that which an association as a whole would take.
Well, I think that the people, the association as a whole took the position that they would fight for the rights of the people who were being really very badly treated in the community
Mhm.
and poorly served in the community. I don't think that the individual social worker would challenge that, but they didn't want to be part of that active group,
Mhm.
and there was nothing wrong with that.
Mhm. What were some of the issues that, in your mind, required social action as an approach in those days?
Oh, well, pretty much the same as it is today. Housing, housing, standards of relief, health care. Remember, we didn't have health care. We did not have universal programs for the senior citizens. We worked hard to get the first old age security program going.
Mhm.
Um, I would, then the other thing is our great concern for the unemployed youth particularly, and uh, the unattached single woman was always a problem then, just as it is today.
How so? How were they problems?
Well, they're not problems. They had a problem living, because society has not really ever done very much up until just recently. The single woman was always the low man on the, that is a peculiar thing to call, low woman on the totem pole.
At the time you were working at the Family Welfare Association, was the Family Welfare Association involved in these and supportive of these social action initiatives?
Yes, very much so. Gave a great deal of leadership, I think, of people like Gwyneth Howell
Mhm.
and Eleanor Barnstead and G.B. Clark, who were all very active, and Charlie Young of the I don't know what they called it then. It was the Council of Social Agencies, I think, or the Federation, one or the other.
Mhm.
But no, they were all outstanding leaders on behalf of changing
Mhm.
and improving the conditions of the poor.
Mhm. In order to help myself and the other people who will see this material or hear it understand what it was like then, could you take us through a day of your life at that time that would help us understand how you did your work?
Well, that would be very difficult to do, how I did my work. I'm not quite sure.
Well, see, I don't know how things used to be done, and I know that when I was doing social planning at the local level and advocacy, it seemed I spent all of my time on telephone and occasionally in face-to-face meetings, but I didn't see clients very much, if at all, because I was working with the, quote, power structure, end quote.
Oh, well, no. All the time I was with the Family Welfare in Montreal, although I was in a supervisory capacity, I worked with the staff members in our area, and I always carried a small caseload myself in order to get a feel of what was really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I recall we used to have staff meetings very frequently as things got bad and it was the relief rates going down instead of up, and talk about what happened. I remember us being told that we had no more money to give for relief and having to say to our clients, "We're sorry, this is the last check we have to give you, and we will have to go to your alderman and see what you can do." And that nearly broke a lot of the young workers. Couldn't stand this. It was a dreadful situation to see a man come in to talk to you and say, this is the last check, we have run out of funds, because you see, we didn't have the money. There was not the government support that was coming, and so you can see why the agency as a whole was 100% behind any action that would deal with this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How were the activities of the Family Welfare Association funded in those days?
Well, through the Federation, this group. Well, you might be interested to know that when we used to get some money from the provincial government by public relations for the unattached women. They were mostly women who were supposed to be unemployable. We used to get some money from the government to help finance that service.
Mm-hmm. But the rest of it would come through the
voluntary gifts and through the raising money through the Federation. But of course, the fundraising in that back in the 1930s was peanuts compared to the millions that we do now, because the community as a whole wasn't organized to give, wholehearted support to funding of community services.
Mm-hmm. So the funding would come in from private donations.
That's right.
And fundraising drives and things like that. Okay. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add about that time in Montreal. You were in Montreal from 1936 to 1945.
Yeah. Well, while I was there, the Family Welfare Association loaned me to two different organizations to go in and do a survey of what they're doing and a reorganization job.
Mm-hmm.
One was an organization called the Women's Sheltering Home. And this was, again, homeless women who came into Montreal and had no place to go. And there was this organization called the Sheltering Home, where they would take them in for a very limited period of time and try to find some place to send them from there. Sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. And the thing really got out of control, so I was loaned to that organization for 6 months to go in and recommend a reorganization. And I guess my major recommendation to them at that point was that they were getting involved in taking in a lot of people who were quite seriously disturbed mentally. Mm-hmm. And they weren't equipped to handle that. So as a result of that, they completely revamped this, and it was a temporary shelter for women coming into the city until they could find a more permanent place to stay. Mm-hmm. And the second one was an exciting one. I was up in Toronto having an appendix operation when I got a letter from Mr. Clark, my boss in Montreal, saying, "We surely hope that you'll be back at the job soon. We hear that you're making good progress, but we have agreed to lend you to the Protestant Orphans' Homes because they're in need of a big reorganization job, and we felt you were just the person to do it." When I got back to Montreal, I found that the Protestant Orphans' Home, which was the oldest institution, I guess, at that time in Montreal, it was a huge, big gray stone building on the side of the mountain, and it provided a home for 90 children, ranging in age from 6 months to 16 years. Mm-hmm. And they had a review recommended by the Federation of Community Services of their program, and the Child Welfare League of America, I think it was, I'm not certain about that, but I think it was the Child Welfare League, had come in and had recommended that they were too routine and they had to modernize their approach and they had to individualize the kids more. They had to stop taking them to school in a crocodile lineup. They had to allow them to have more individualized clothing, and they had to have smaller groups for the staff to supervise. The result was they brought in a perfectly good superintendent with the understanding that she would do all of these things. The kids had never known anything else except this rigid discipline. You get up at a certain time, you eat at a certain time, you eat everything or else you go to bed without any dessert. You all wear the same kind of blouse and skirt. You all do this at the same time or else. And the result was the children were so completely discombobulated by this freedom, they couldn't use it. So what did? They rioted. Now, if you have ever seen kids of that age riot, you have no idea how bad it was. So I went there, having got out of my bed of pain, to go up there. It was an exciting experience. I went and I agreed to stay 5 months, and I stayed 15 months.
Mm-hmm.
We got the kids used to get outside of my bedroom door at night and get the fire axe and throw it through the transom. And I learned that the thing I'd do was move my bed over right under the door, because then the axe would go over my bed and not onto the bed. But I could tell you some wild experiences, but it was really a very exciting time for the kids and for me. Every morning a group met up in the home. Eric Schmidt, who was the head of the Child Welfare Agency in Montreal, and a psychiatrist from, I think, for the mental health. So I don't know what they called it, I've forgotten it now. Anyway, it was a mental health clinic. And I met every morning to discuss the kids that were out of control and who had to be disciplined, and to decide whether they should have a strap or they should be put in isolation, because we discovered that the acceptable methods of handling children wouldn't work in that situation. We were dealing in a very peculiar situation, and I did not, of course, administer. Eric Schmidt used, if the boy or girl had to be strapped, Eric Schmidt did it, not me. Mm-hmm. And they said that otherwise I could never function there. I had to be removed a little from that. Anyway, in the 15 months I was there, we put all the little babies into foster homes, as the Child Welfare Agency did. The boys all went to the Rexdale, I think it was called Rexdale Boys Club, and the girls were all taken out of school early. That was my first time. And we took them up to a beautiful camp up in the Laurentians. And while we were up there, we had the whole inside of the building remodeled. Nice little bedrooms, pretty curtains on the window, so that when they came back to a completely changed environment. Mm-hmm. And after being 3 months at camp with a beautiful group of counselors, many of whom were students at the School of Social Work who came and worked as counselors up at the summer camp, their attitudes changed, and they began to like themselves. Mm-hmm. And they began to have a healthy respect for adults, and so they went back into this new environment, and it was really a very rewarding experience. Mm-hmm. Working with those girls.
Mm-hmm. So then when the thing reopened under new conditions and things, the infants were gone and the boys were gone, and it became
teenage girls only were there.
Teenage girls. And
we changed the name from Protestant Orphans Home to Summerhill House. It was on Summerhill Avenue, so we called it Summerhill House.
Mm-hmm. How had it happened that the orphanage had ended up with so many disturbed kids?
That I couldn't tell you. Except in those days, kids who weren't getting along with their families were just placed in these huge institutions, and I think the environment itself produced the disturbance. Mm-hmm. These were kids that didn't know whether anybody loved them or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you went there, were any of the kids being, what's the term, hired out? In some orphans' homes, the girls were out for domestic service during the day, and the boys were out for.
No, I don't think so. I don't recall that at all. That wasn't a problem as I remember. Mm-hmm. No.
Okay. Also during that period, and during the time that you were in Montreal, was the time the Second World War was going on. What kind of impact did that have, if I might ask, on the services that were required and the things that you as a social worker were doing?
Well, I have a difficult time trying to recall that, except that many of my professional colleagues, of course, had gone into the armed services. I was asked to go into the Navy, and I was torn because it sounded a little glamorous, and then I decided that I was there with these little kids in Summerhill House, and I felt my duty was to stay exactly where I was, and I decided to stay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. From Montreal, you went west, young man?
Yep.
Went west. How did it happen that you moved to Winnipeg?
Well, you know, I'd had a long experience with Winnipeg, with the YWCA in Toronto and in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was well known to the YWCA. And so I got a letter from Louise Gates in the National Council of the YWCA asking me if I would consider going to Winnipeg as the executive director of that association. By this time I was really quite exhausted working with the Summerhill House situation, and I felt it was time for me to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
So I went out to Winnipeg, and that's where I saw a completely different impact of the war.
What were you seeing?
Well, we saw there, we had the problem of the teenage boys who were too young to get in the army and who felt that they weren't important to anybody, and so they were developing all sorts of weird gangs. And so courageous staff that I had, very great staff, we decided we'd set up a teen canteen, and we had these teenagers have their teenage dances there every Saturday night, and there were hundreds of them came.
Mm-hmm.
They used to charge their own admission fee, and they had a beautiful budget. The YWCA couldn't get enough money to keep its program going at any decent level, but the teenage canteen, they had so much money they didn't know what to do with it. So we would borrow their equipment from them. And they loved the YWCA because we were giving them shelter.
Yeah.
And so most of those boys, they were great boys, very destructive at points. They used to have terrible fights on Saturday night. They used to take the Gideon Bible and put them in their football socks and use that as their weapons, or Coke bottles, or other kinds of bottles, I assume. And but most of those boys later ended up on the Winnipeg. A lot of them did, not most, but a lot of them ended up in the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Yeah, yeah. But that was where we could see the other side of the war. What happened to the people who were just too young to get into the services and therefore didn't feel as important to the community as their older brothers or their fathers who were in the war services.
I've heard that in other communities across the country during that time, the kids were rioting.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Was that the kind of thing that you were seeing too?
On a smaller scale, I think that's why we were putting on the teen canteen, was our contribution to the community. Let's get them organizing their own leisure time activities and putting on their dances. And of course that was at the time of the Zoot Suit, you know, so we had some weird costumes at our Saturday night dances.
Mm-hmm.
But they were great kids.
You were working for the YWCA, and yet you were dealing with boys. What did the YMCA think about that?
Oh, we got along fine. The YMCA was right across the schoolyard from us. I don't think they had a canteen. No, I'm sure they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I don't think they particularly wanted the boys that came to our teen canteen. I think they were quite happy to have us try to work with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we had a very good relationship with the YMCA in Winnipeg.
Uh-huh.
Very good.
Okay. You moved on a bit later, in 1948, I guess it was, 1947 or so?
Yeah.
You came back to Toronto. Again, you made a move and came to what was it called then, the Toronto Welfare Council?
That's right.
When you began at that organization, did you have any particular goals or hopes for what you might accomplish at that organization?
No, except that the United Way, which was then called the United Charities, I've forgotten the name of it, at any rate, had reorganized, and the Welfare Council, on an experimental basis, really, was set up as a department of the community chest. And it was, I would say, an unsuccessful experiment. I nearly went mad trying to work through it, because there was the community chest board, and then there was the Welfare Council Board, and it was also elected at amendment, but it was responsible to the board of the chest. And you can understand that there were a great many tensions and a great many conflicts because the Welfare Council was interested, as all councils are, in social action and really spotting things in the community that needed change. So very often, the things we wanted to do proved to be an embarrassment to the fundraisers who needed to keep in the good graces of the people who could give the financial support. So that we worked it out, but it was very rough going at times. We were fortunate in the fact that we had an executive director of the chest, a man by the name of Bill Dewar, and he was a very fine person, and he shared many of the goals and the aims of the Welfare Council. And then when he left, they brought in a very powerful fundraiser. I guess he's one of the best fundraisers in North America, John Yerger. And John Yerger was a fascinating executive director, and he and I used to meet regularly every week to talk about how we could work effectively together. Both of us very much aware of the areas of potential conflict between the two organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And it was after John Yerger came, and I don't recall the exact year of that we began to think that the experiment of having the Planning Council as a department of the community chest was a mistake, that the council should be free to do its social planning and community development. And we recruited a very prominent businessman in Toronto who was well known in the community and highly regarded in the community, M. Wallace McCutcheon, QC. And Wally McCutcheon came in as our president, and the first thing he did was say, this has got to be separated. And the Welfare Council is going to be turned into a separate council, and we debated what the title was, and I guess we were the first group in Canada to use the term Social Planning Council.
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked that through with Wally as our president. It was really very exciting.
When, a number of questions about this. Were you the first director of the Welfare Council?
No.
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 They had started
You mean the predecessor to the social plan? No, I followed Bessie Tizell.
Okay, all right, so that got that straight then. When you were director of the Welfare Council, before it changed, were you doing some of the work of a Community Chest or United Fund, some of their, what we now call allocations, planning, helping them decide how to spend money?
Yes. And we used to give recommendations with regard to agencies asking for admission. We sat on their allocations committee. As a matter of fact, the director of the Welfare Council was an advisor to the Central Allocations Committee.
Mm-hmm. How did that affect your own agencies or organizations' relationship with the agencies?
Well, it was a very interesting one because we used to, for example, be asked every year to give a recommendation on the priority of fundings. If there wasn't enough money to go around, where should the money be spent? What would be the first, second, and third priorities? And we, of course, always involved the agencies in developing our priority ratings so that they all got in there. They didn't like our decisions necessarily, but at least they knew what was going on. It was all above board. And so the agencies tended to look to the Welfare Council for fair recommendations, even though they might not entirely agree with how we had rated their service.
Mm-hmm. So you're part
And of course, we were very active in the campaign. We all worked very hard on the annual campaign.
In what way?
Canvassing, door-to-door canvassing,
Mm-hmm.
taking on certain groups to do special canvasses for. But in other words, we were expected as a department of the fund to get in there and work put our shoulder to the wheel when we were out raising the funds.
So one of the tasks of the organization then was working with United Way in meeting some of their goals. Regarding the other activities of the council, what other kinds of work was the council doing at that time?
We were doing all sorts of controversial things. We were, as usual, out on working hard on the issue of housing and the relief rates, and our complete disgust, I guess you could almost call it, with the level of relief allowances in the city. And our really, we were highly indignant that Ontario had not signed an agreement with the federal government to share the expenses for a public assistance program. We had made all sorts of representations to the province and got no place. Until this Wally McCutcheon came on the scene, and that's when we began to realize that you had to have someone who could communicate to the power structure in the community to get things done. You know, there was a book published just around that time called Who Makes Community Decisions? It was published also under the title of The Community Power Structure. And we saw that happen when Wally McCutcheon went with us up to see Premier Frost, and he'd say to me, I want you to bring along with you somebody from the Salvation Army with a Salvation Army uniform on, and I'd like to see a Catholic priest there with his collar on. And this was when I began to see how these people in the power structure operated. And we had 2 meetings with Premier Frost with this representative group, and we got the thing signed in Ottawa. I think we would never have got it through as quickly as we did if it had not been for Wally McCutcheon and the prestige and the clout he carried in the political arena.
Did you see any? I shouldn't phrase it that way. I'm prejudging your answers here. How did the kind of the style of operation that you were seeing with Mr. McCutcheon, how did that fit with what you knew as social work principles and ethics and that
No
sort of
conflict. No conflict whatsoever. He was much more clear on what the role of a president was and what the role of an executive director was.
Oh?
Very clear. He'd say, well, I can't say on this recording what he would say, but at any rate, he would say, what do you think we're paying you for? You do that. Things that up to that point the presidents always held, very close to their best. Wally McCutcheon was very clear of what he said, that's my job and that is your job. And it would made it very much easier to work under those circumstances.
What about that, the relationship between board and staff? There's still, the debate goes on as to whose role and whose responsibility is what. What did you see as your role as a paid staff member in those days?
My role was
what,
to give the leadership to the staff and to advise the board and to provide the facts to the board on what kind of policies they should be considering. And to keep them fully informed. I think that very often where there is tension between the paid staff and the board is because the paid staff don't share with the board the issues that should be brought before them for discussion. Sometimes staff have tended to bring to the board something where they've already decided what the answer is and simply ask for a rubber stamp. Well, if you worked with Wally McCutcheon, you didn't expect a rubber stamp, I can assure you.
Some of the other things that councils were doing, I think at those times, they were operating some direct services. Did your council ever operate like a volunteer bureau or a clothing exchange or a social service index?
Index, yes. Well, it was while I was there that we dropped our social service index, and that was a very painful thing because you see, The whole concept of the social service index was to see that that the clients weren't cheating the public, which is very interesting. The concept of the social worker was to make sure that the client got the kind of service they needed, and that this was not really a detective service at all.
Mm-hmm.
We got to the point where there was so much suspicion of how the social service index operated that some of the agencies were not registering, so it became very ineffective anyway. And so we dropped it, saying if there's good working relationship between agencies, they don't need to have an index. You can pick up the phone, and also you have no right checking with an agency unless the client knows and is willing to have this checked.
Mm-hmm. Who would have opposed the dissolution or the abolition of the social service index?
Oh, well, I think the people who were involved in the service. Whenever you try to drop any service, the people who oppose the dropping of it are the people whose life has been given to it. And I think that that's right. Otherwise, you could have chaos.
So that would have been the staff who were doing that service?
Yeah, I think the staff were very upset that we were dropping the index, because the 2 or 3 people who were on staff when I went there had been with it for many, many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we tried to make a fair settlement with them when
Mm-hmm.
we closed the operation down.
How did your funders feel about that?
Oh, they went along with it. Oh, they went along with it. You see, actually, I guess when you work in social planning, it becomes obvious that as long as you communicate what the issue is, and as long as everybody is well informed about why you're doing it, and is satisfied
Mm-hmm.
with the explanation, you don't get the backlash that you get when something's suddenly imposed on them.
Mm-hmm.
So the good community organization process works.
Okay.
Volunteer bureau, yes.
You,
We had a volunteer bureau, yes. And it was while I was there that we worked toward having it turned into the community, an independent agency, although there was a lot of feeling about that, about whether it should be independent. It was just after I left the council that it actually was transferred into an independent community chest agency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, the other question I want to ask you about that period of time in your work at the Welfare Council, actually 2 questions, of which I just forgot the first one. My mind went blank.
Couldn't have been very important.
No, actually, my mind is sort of skittering around today. Yet the question was about relationships amongst people, amongst organizations that had responsibility for social planning or had some involvement or interest in social planning, like perhaps the city government. You didn't have regional government in Toronto then.
Oh, it came in while I was here.
Did it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, we were very much involved. I think that was the main difference between the old Welfare Council and the Social Planning Council, because the Social Planning Council really was the 3rd stage in the development. In the beginning, it was the Council of Social Agencies, where it was the agencies getting together and deciding what things they could do together and what things they could do separately. Then that went into the Council of the Welfare Council, and again, it was primarily agency-centered, and it brought in more than just the agencies, but I guess your public departments. But the Social Planning Council, the whole vision we had there was to be the broadest type of community organization in which you would have all levels of government, all community services, whether they were in the United Fund or under the Welfare Department. So we broadened our membership to include really very, very wide spectrum of organizations in metropolitan Toronto. And then, of course, we got into the whole question of how you decided what agency should expand to serve the whole metropolitan community. Because when you ask for money to support a metropolitan social planning council, then some of these municipalities will say, well, that's fine, but then what services are we going to get? And what are you going to do to help us plan our services? And so we developed during those first few years with the Social Planning Council, the area councils, in which there was a branch of the Social Planning Council in Scarborough, one in, I think it was North York, one in Etobicoke. There were three or four to begin with anyway. And then, as you perhaps know, over the years, they have become almost autonomous in the way they have functioned.
Were, again, at the time that the organization changed from the Welfare Council to the Social Planning Council, you mentioned broadening membership. Did your membership at that time include individuals?
Oh yes, we always had individual members. Always had individual members.
Because that was certainly not the case with some planning councils. Okay. I think that concludes the section of the questions that I have on that section. Is there more that you'd like to add about the Welfare Council, Social Planning Council?
No, except I suppose that from my point of view, the most ambitious thing we did that required tremendous cooperation from every level of government and from every agency in Toronto, whether it was a government agency or a voluntary agency, was the big study we started in 1962, and it took us 2 years to do it, was the Needs and Resources Study. And that was a fabulous undertaking in which we established priority of needs and recommendations to how they could be met over the next years ahead. And we had full cooperation. We had from all the municipalities, from all the agencies. They all provided information. We had several little offspring studies in connection with it, like the needs of the multi-problem families. We had one on prostitution. Then we had wonderful workshops and good leadership on voluntary public financing, the future of financing welfare services in metropolitan Toronto. And we made some fairly bold recommendations about certain services that should be curtailed and others that should be expanded. Most of them worked out very well. They didn't all get 100% support, but by and large, I think that those that didn't accept the proposed changes 100% certainly were prepared to modify their program.
Your work in the Needs and Resources Studies served as sort of a model for the Needs and Resources Studies that were done all across the country afterwards, didn't they?
Yeah, I went right across the country talking about how to do a needs and
did you?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, a lot of the communities asked me to come and speak on how we did it, and there was a professor at the School of Social Work, I forget what his name now, he's Scottish, he is. Anyway, he wrote to me a couple of years ago and said, you know, I always felt I should write and tell you, Florence, that your book on the Needs and Resources Study is considered a classic here at the University of Edinburgh. Yeah? I'd probably say, well, you know, a prophet is not without honor, saving his own country.
So that was a model. That leads me to ask sort of a general summing up question that relates to this time period, but also to your later career, and that's the link between research, facts, and social action. Social planning councils are noted for producing research that is of varying quality, but often very good quality, which gives a lot of numbers and statistics. But sometimes their recommendations aren't acted upon. What do you see as the link between three things: the profession, facts, and social progress?
I don't think that the social planning councils were getting any place when we were muddling along, getting together a group of facts, until we began to realize the importance of really competent research staff to undertake our research studies. I think we were in deep trouble. And I think that one of the things that has evolved really in the last 20 years at Canada is that every social planning council and many of the agencies have realized that facts aren't enough. You have to have some kind of a plan of why you're gathering the facts and the use of which you make. I can always remember, may I tell you a little aside story, because it's funny.
Sure.
When there was a problem during the sometime in the 1950s anyway, when there was a huge rise in alcoholism in Ontario, and there was a great deal of concern being expressed all over the place. And the big issue was, if alcohol wasn't so readily available, would you have so much alcoholism? Wasn't there a link there? So the breweries, or I don't know whether it's brewery, anyways, the people who make alcohol, I think they're more than the breweries, came to see me the distillers, came to see me one day and said, would the Social Planning Council be prepared to do a study on the relationship between the availability of alcohol and alcoholism? So I got together a group of our best research people, because we had a lot of good research people on our planning committees, amongst whom was Al Rose. And we had lunch together, and I asked them to guide me on what I was to say back to these people, and the answer was 100%. Yes, we would do the study, but I must emphasize that we would have to have complete freedom to publish our findings regardless of what those findings were. And if it was that availability of alcoholism was a major contributing factor to alcoholism, we were going to say it. Well, that was very interesting. I went back to see them, and this one man, whom I knew very well personally, said to me, Florence, there's no problem, because we know that's not true. And I said, but you see, if you go into this research project with that in mind, I'm not sure that we would want to go ahead with it if you're so convinced of what the outcome is going to be. Anyway, they turned it down, but a fascinating thing out of that was they took that money, some of it that they were going to give us to do the study, to pay a certain person to go down to a big conference on alcoholism in the States. And the person that went down was Dave Archibald. Mm-hmm. And he came back and became the executive director of the addiction research foundation. Yeah, it wasn't called that then, it was the addiction foundation, you see. And so that it worked and came around a different way, and probably much better, because I think a research study on it wouldn't have had nearly the impact that that organization has had on this community.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So facts is one way to get some change going.
That's right, absolutely.
Well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, maybe that'd be a good place to take a break. Should we stop?
Yeah, let's have a stop and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something.
Okay, I guess perhaps how we could begin the second section is by just saying that I would ask why you left the Planning Council and how it happened that you went to Ottawa. And then you can focus, if you want to mention the job at Canadian Welfare Council, fine, or if you just want to move directly to CSW, that's okay too. Just whatever you want to do. And if we could try and keep this section to about 35 minutes, that would allow, or 30 minutes even, because that would allow me time to ask you some summary questions. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right?
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, Ms. Philpott, when we broke off, we were talking about your work at the Toronto Social Planning Council. You left in 1963, is that right? Mm-hmm. How did it happen you left the council, and where did you go?
I have a theory, and I still believe in it, that you make probably your best contribution, if not your total contribution, to any organization within 10 years. And I have been with the Social Planning Council for 16. And my last big project was the Needs and Resources Study. And I made it quite well known that I had no intention of continuing after that report was tabled. And Reuben Bates, who had just gone to the council, knew me quite well. And he phoned me one day and said, well, I consider coming on his staff down there. as a consultant on community planning to work with funds and councils across the country, and I said yes. So that's how I got down there.
Mm-hmm. Working with funds and councils, that was when the funds and councils were part of the Canadian Welfare Council,
That's right.
was it?
That was a division. I think they
Mhm.
called them then the division, and the person responsible for the fund side of the division was a man by the name, I think his last name was Smith. He was from the States, very nice man. And I was really devoting all of my time to the whole question of councils.
Mm-hmm. What were you trying to do with the councils?
Trying to get some understanding of what the function of a council ought to be, trying to find out what the councils were doing, to see what assistance we could give to councils to improve their operation. And they were as different as night and day. I mean, every community's setup was very individual, and you had the same problem as Toronto had some communities where the council was part of the chest. We had others where it was completely separated, so separated that they didn't even talk to each other. There were some places where there was a council but no fundraising group, and there were other communities where there was a fundraising organization but no council.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a lot of consultation with various communities, and during my time there, councils were set up in several places as a result of my consultations there.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was a readiness for it, or otherwise they wouldn't have asked for it, I expect.
Mm-hmm. So you were at the Canadian Welfare Council in 1963 and 1964,
That's right.
And then moved on to the Canadian Association of Social Workers.
That's right.
Again, I'm always interested in these transitions, how a person gets from one job to another.
Well, I went upstairs.
Yeah.
Right? No, I found that, again, the councils and the funds were going through such a struggle of trying to really decide the directions they wanted to take, that I felt that, again, I had probably been in that field long enough to make any kind of a contribution, and that probably they need some younger person to get in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you'll be interested to know that in one of those little articles I gave you this morning, there's one as a head social worker in Canada leaves to do something anyway. It goes on to say, this gray-haired lady who is now preparing to retire has spoke at this meeting someplace and talked about what she saw as the future of funds and particularly of social work. And I thought, gee, that was in 1965, and I was getting to retire then, and here I am still struggling on. So that was it. I went up to the CASW because Joy Maines had submitted her resignation
Mm-hmm.
to the CSW, and she and Anne Dumoulin said, why don't we go out, because Anne, of course, was working with me in the council section of the Canadian Council. She called me and said, why don't you take on the CASW job?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, that would be a nice, different kind of a job for me to do, so I took it on.
Mm-hmm. Did you have hopes and goals for that job?
Yes, to strengthen the profession in Canada. It was just that simple, because we were still struggling to get recognition. I think that after the war, we made great gains. I think social work really came into its own for a few years after World War II. And then suddenly we started to go backwards. There was no doubt about it, because everybody got themselves all excited about the evils of the welfare state. Social workers weren't doing all that well right across the country. The problem of board-staff relationships continued to rear its ugly head, and social workers weren't necessarily handling it very well, and certainly boards weren't handling it very well. So my goal there was to try to clarify what the role of the profession was and how to strengthen the profession in its function in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very, I think, rewarding experience again.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you two questions along two lines about that. One is the developments in the organization itself that had to do with your goals for strengthening the profession. the organization did change over the years that you were there. Could you give us some of the background on that and then what happened and why?
Yes, you see, originally, all of these groups that got organized in provinces and in cities were provincial branches or city branches of the Canadian Association of Social Work. And while I was there, you began to get the rumblings from various provinces across Canada saying, we don't want to be the BC branch of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. We want to be the BC Association of Social Workers. Manitoba. This was true right across the country. There were varying degrees of accepting the idea of a branch operation. And at the other extreme, those who felt that it should be a completely independent provincial organizations, and municipal branches would be branches of the provincial organizations, and that the CASW should turn into a federation of provincial associations. We had very interesting discussions on it, and I was fascinated because the last province to give in was Ontario. Ontario, right till the last dog wagged its tail, still wanted to be a branch of the Canadian Association of Social Workers.
Why would an organization hold that view?
I think they felt it. I think there's some people right today across the country who feel it. That you're stronger if you have a strong national spokesman for the profession. And that if you branch off and have these little sections operating autonomously, that you don't have as much clout as a single voice of the profession for all of Canada.
I'm sorry, I either misunderstood or didn't hear right. People felt that a strong national voice would be more effective
than having several organizations of social workers.
Okay, all right. So then what was going to be the role of a national organization that was a federation of provincial branches?
Well, a lot of people ask that. If it was just a federation, if it was just a coordinating body, did it in fact lose its leadership role, or did it, you see, your single organization spoke out for social workers in Canada, and your provincial branches would relate the policy position to the provincial situation. Eventually, and I think it was really after I left, no, it was while I was still there, that Ontario came in and became part of this federation of provincial associations. I don't know, because after I leave, you know, I have a theory also, that once I leave anything, I never look back. Because I feel it's unfair for the person who's held a job, especially a person who throws themselves into the job, as I tend to do. You tend to want to protect. You say, oh my gosh, for 5 years I struggled to get that through, and look what they've done to it. I never go back, I never ask a question. If what I've said when I was there doesn't carry the day, that's too bad. And so I don't know what's happened since then. I really do not know what's happened since then. I don't see any new, in all those news releases I've given you, you can see where I went across this country spouting off at every opportunity about what the profession of social work stood for and what the issues were. I don't remember seeing anything in the press here since I've been back in Toronto saying what the CASW stands for. Now I'm sure it's doing some very interesting and exciting things, but they are not up front. Is that fair?
I think it's hard for anybody in a social organization to be up front these days. It's hard to get good press. It's hard to get press at all. But, however, I wasn't trying to encourage you to make a comparison of now and then. I was trying to get a better understanding of what was happening then, because as I thought it through, or tried to, I couldn't understand the pros and cons, or the reasons why, the reasons for having such provincial autonomy and strength.
Well, of course, the argument then was that your welfare legislation and health legislation, it's all provincial. And therefore, they're the only people who can speak with authority and effectively at the provincial level. A national agency can't come in and start telling the provinces what they ought to do.
Maybe a piece of context just occurred to me here that at that time, well, I don't know, when did this happen? When did this event happen?
What event?
Not amalgamation, but the federation.
Oh, it evolved fairly slowly, I must say. And I guess, as I say, I think the last, I'm about to write a history of the Ontario Association. I promised to do it a year ago, and I've got all my papers in there still. I haven't got around to doing it. Really, I expect that it was around 1962 that Ontario went in as the Provincial Association of Professional Social Workers.
Then the background information I was thinking of, which was the implementation of the Canada Assistance Plan, is sort of relevant then, because I think that appeared to me anyway to make a big difference in the federal role. I'll have to think that one through myself.
Yeah, I would have to too, because I'm not quite certain how that fits in with the...
Well, what I was thinking was that the federal role in social welfare had been apparent for a while with categorical legislation.
That's right.
With the implementation of the Canada Assistance Plan, a sort of unity and maybe a little stronger and certainly more coordinated federal role appears to have come.
That's right.
Were you executive director at the time that the BC delegation came to Ottawa and made a presentation about the need for a strong provincial association? Do you remember that?
Very strong.
Brian Iverson and some other people from the West came
Oh, yes. Yeah.
out. Yeah, I was just, again, trying to place...
That was part of that whole process.
Mm-hmm.
It was part of that where BC was saying, we don't need any group in Ottawa telling us how to run our show in BC.
Mm-hmm.
We're quite capable of running it. And I can remember Hill, there was a man out there by the name of
Ernie Hill?
Ernie Hill, and he was the spokesman. I remember that very clearly, yeah.
What were some of the other issues that the association was dealing with at the time that you were executive director?
Well, we were dealing with a revamped code of ethics, which needed to be brought up to date, and we did that. We were dealing with the need for policy statements on all sorts of issues where we had gone around for years taking stands bits and pieces, but where we, during my stay with the association, they came out with a series of policy statements that were really very good.
Mm-hmm.
Really very good.
Mm-hmm. During the time that you were executive director, which was what, from 64 to 71?
Yeah.
Some major legislation came through Canada Assistance Plan, Medicare, Canada Pension Plan. The guaranteed annual income was an idea that was discussed a lot during that period of time. And the whole idea, and perhaps the reality of a war on poverty. How was the Social Work Association involved in those issues?
I don't recall us, because you had your Canadian Council on Social Development was very, very active in that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Professional Association was quite clear that we didn't move into areas that were being well taken care of through other appropriate organizations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't remember us taking strong stands in those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Except we spoke out in favor or against them publicly. But it wasn't a unified, focused attack on any of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask you two questions about the reorganization, the change in structure of the of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. The second question that I wanted to ask you about that was, you had mentioned that the reorganization, how can I say, that there was a relationship between the role of the profession and the change in structure. I'm wondering if you could outline what the role of the profession is in your view.
Are you talking about the role of the profession or the role of the professional association?
Well,
they're different.
Yes, I'll take both if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the role of your professional association really is to provide a channel through which the social work profession can express its major concerns and views on matters of community welfare. I think it's the organization who really should control, the practice of social work, and that's where in your different provincial associations now, they are able to do something which a national agency could not have done, but which a national organization would support wholeheartedly once it got in the works, and that is that they would in fact monitor their own professional group, see what kind of standards are being set up, establish registration and eventually use of title. And those were all things that were very much in the works when I was with the CSW, and those were the things that really, I suppose, exerted a major influence on having strong provincial associations, because that could only happen. There's only about 2 organizations, because I did a study when I was with the, now that I remember it, with the CASW, on what organizations were organized nationally and what were organized provincially and then federated nationally. I think there are only about 3 organizations where that role is carried by the national agency. And I was thinking, that one of them, I think, the Boy Scouts, for instance, I think is dominated from the top down. I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the Girl Guides. I went with the Girl Guides for a few months after I left Ottawa to help them reorganize their national council.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, the professions have left the question of registration, standard setting, discipline, and ethics to their local provincial groups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the role of the professional association is communication where appropriate, and supporting the provincial organizations to do what is a matter of provincial mandate, I suppose would be.
That's right, and being a spokesman for the provincial association where this seems to be the most appropriate and useful function, because sometimes another body can be more effective in expressing a point of view than the people who are most directly concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does a situation like that come to your mind?
No.
I'll tell you later about one that came to my mind. The other part of the question then that I invited you to respond to was the role of the profession itself. What are social workers here for?
Well, you see, this is a very interesting question you're asking. Because when I came into the field, social workers were there to work with the people in need of help and assistance and guidance and encouragement and support. It was direct service to people. And over the years, the social work profession has changed its emphasis and has put it far more on policy development, community development, research, and what else? You see, you wouldn't get people over at the School of Social Work now teaching the courses that were taught when I was there.
No, I wouldn't imagine.
No. And on the other hand, when I was there, they certainly did not have people on faculty who were capable of teaching research.
Mm-hmm.
So that I mean, I think the social worker's role has changed, and the social worker's role now has become more highly sophisticated and technical than it was in the early days.
Has that had an impact, in your view, on the credibility of the profession?
No, I think I don't think it's had an impact on the credibility, but what it has had, it's had a tremendous impact on the relationship between the paid staff and the volunteer.
How so?
Well, I think at the present time it's very difficult to recruit and retain the interest of really good volunteers, because they feel sometimes, I think, intimidated by the professional social worker. And this isn't because a professional social worker sets out to make them feel inferior, but they do feel they can't really hold their own with the professional social worker. So that I think that volunteers more and more are questioning, where do they fit, if any place, in the social welfare scene at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very true. Last year I was on, for a year I did a job for the volunteer center here in Toronto, trying to get them reorganized. And one of the things that came out loud and clear was this feeling of almost, in some cases, almost mistrust between the paid staff and the volunteers in the community agencies, that the volunteers weren't given proper orientation, they weren't given proper supervision, they weren't brought along with the policies of the agencies, and that the social workers were far too selective in what they would tell the volunteer. So that I think that this is one of the professionalizing of social work has changed the relationship, and we haven't given enough attention as to how we can do it and still make both groups effective.
Mm-hmm. And particularly at this point in time, many people are saying that the welfare state is gone, or certainly on its way out, and the need for volunteers, perhaps it's an unfortunate, that term has an unfortunate connotation, but the need for people to take more responsibility for themselves, their families, and the community. Maybe the professionalization of social work has sort of cut resources that are going to be required out from underneath us.
Well, I'm not quite so sure of that. I don't know how they would cut out the resources. What do you mean by that particularly?
A willing and able, or at least a willing volunteer. If volunteers will no longer or are less likely to do volunteer work because social workers won't trust them, we lose a resource.
Oh, I think that that's what the volunteer thinks, and I think there's a difference between what the reality is and what the volunteer thinks. Mm-hmm. Is that the social workers don't mm-hmm. trust them. I think there was never a time in the history of Toronto, for example, where there was a greater need and a more demand by the part of agencies for volunteers. Mm-hmm. Tremendous need for volunteers. But it's to recruit the volunteers. Now, one of the reasons is that we're back in the Middle Ages in thinking about what volunteers are. They're no longer the ladies with their white gloves on, available to run around with their calves foot jelly, you know. I mean, after all, there are not all those women of leisure in the community now. If women have time, they get a paid job, and that's the reality mm-hmm. of the community that we're living in. A volunteer today expects more from her experience as a volunteer. Mm-hmm. It isn't that she just goes in and gets all her satisfaction about feeling she's doing good, because that's not what that doesn't meet her expectations.
No, that's not what it is now.
No.
Along the same lines, another question as we're moving towards some more general kinds of summary questions. Hey, what about, you had mentioned early on in the interview when you were talking about Montreal and the importance of social action in the way that you did your work, the way that you tried to accomplish your goals. Has that changed, do you think, for you over the years?
Oh, I think that the exciting thing that's happening now in the community is just marvelous. And that is how citizens organize themselves and go out after their own thing out in the community. I think these demonstrations, and I think these demonstrations are working. I don't think there's any doubt that there are certain things that have happened right here in Toronto within the last 6 months that happened because people went out on marches and got together and made their position clear to the community. I think that City Hall here in Toronto, for example, is very, very sensitive to groups who organize and demonstrate. And I think for a while this didn't cut any ice at all.
Mm-hmm. Does the profession have a role in that kind of activity, do you think?
No, except to do what the profession always should do, that is give support to the client group that's doing to do it. I think we should be very supportive of groups that want, and I think that we should also participate in demonstrations if we are personally and professionally convinced that what they're demonstrating about needs that kind of activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I'm thinking of is that in Toronto particularly, you're blessed, I suppose some would say, with an active social planning council, the provincial headquarters of the professional association, the provincial headquarters of the planning councils. And not to single out the Ontario Association, but is the profession doing what it should, in your view, today to make things better?
That is a very tough question you've asked. I don't really think I'm in a position to make a comment on that. Mm-hmm. Anything I've seen or heard from the profession I've been impressed with. Mm-hmm. But whether they're doing enough or not, I really don't know, because I've lost a little bit of touch.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to single out the professional association, but one of the things that I've heard over and over again during the course of doing these interviews is the changes in how people do their work. People, I understand, used to work 12 and 14 hours a day and then drive home on their own time in a car that their social agency forced them to buy and pay for.
That's true.
Without mileage expenses.
That's right.
It's not that way today.
It's not that way today, and I'm very glad that it's not. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have any pride in the value of your own work and your own time, then I don't think you should expect anybody else. Now, I have here a handful of letters going back to my earliest days in social work, where I took my first job in Hamilton, and I got paid, I think it was something like, I forget what I got, but practically no cash. I got room and board plus a salary. Then I went to the YWCA in Toronto, and that was fascinating, because they asked me to come and head up this relief program for the unemployed girls, and they offered me $100 a month. And then later, the executive director, Louise Burton, called me and said that since I was living at home and since they were having budget problems, maybe I'd be prepared to work for $75 a month. And I was a very eager young social worker, and I said, yes, I can work for $75, and I could. And as I did that, I worked full day down at the office, and then she came to me in the spring and said they had this holiday house over in the island where working girls could stay. And would I mind going over there and interview people who wanted to stay there? And I used to rush down there and get the 5 o'clock ferry over to the island and check all the people who had applied to come in during the day and talk to the cook, come back early in the morning. Then came the summer, and she came to me and she said, you know, we have this lovely camp up at Parry Sound, and we were wondering if you'd like to take your unemployed girls up there to camp for 3 weeks and put them in with the business girls camp. I didn't realize at the time that it was because the director of the business girls camp had resigned, and so they were really looking for somebody to do the double job. So I went up there, and I had never put foot in a camp before in my life. And I went up there and directed that camp, and it nearly drove me crazy. Because now there was a beautiful example. I was not qualified to direct a camp, you know, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. Then I went from the YW here, and I went to Ottawa, and I got paid more than $75. I got $100 a month, I think it was, in Ottawa. And then I went from Ottawa this is fascinating, you know, these salary things. Like you couldn't believe, I don't know where I put them.
Well, the salary letters I have.
You have them, but anyway, then I go I go to Ottawa, and then I go to Montreal, and the series of letters from Montreal are wonderful. Once a year I got a letter from G.B. Clark. I think I started out there at $1,500 a year or something.
Mm-hmm.
And every year I got a letter saying the board had met, and he was delighted to advise me that they had granted me an increase in salary of $60 a year. And this happened right straight up, right until the very end.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you see, at that particular point, the profession as such took no unified or coordinated effort to do anything about working conditions or salaries for members of their profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the things the profession has done is to work on statements on personnel standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been a major contribution to the field and to the members of the group.
Right. Okay. As you look back over your career in social work, I wonder if there are challenges that you've had to deal with that come to mind particularly.
I don't know. I think that in practically every job I've held, there was always a major challenge. There was always a major challenge to work with the unemployed. There was always a major challenge to deal with people who didn't have any decent housing. There was always the problem of always the problem of the poor. When I go back on it, I expect that the major challenge in every organization, what was happening to the poor, and it is still the problem today.
50 years later.
50 years later, we still have problems
Mm-hmm.
with people not having enough money to pay both the rent and buy their food.
Mm-hmm. I remember what you said in the Wayne Roberts interview from CBC that I was listening to this morning about I think the bitterness is the word that you used in that interview about how the Depression ended, the first Depression. Wondering whether or not we're going to have to have another war to make this one end.
Well, that was the disillusioning thing about that whole business, was how the minute that we had war break out, everybody got a job, people's income increased, there were job opportunities, exciting job opportunities for every level in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, in retrospect, you've done so many things, had such a wide array of experience. I wonder if there are accomplishments that particularly come to mind.
Well, I think that our needs and resources study was a great accomplishment. I think the reorganization of the Protestant Orphans Home in Toronto and Montreal was an accomplishment. I think that the reorganization of the Welfare Council into the Social Planning Council was an accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
But in all of these, I'm a little hesitant to say it was an accomplishment for me. It was an accomplishment for me and the group that was working with me. Because I don't think that in any of these things that I worked on, I was the sole actor. I may have had a leading role in the cast, but there were many other members of the cast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, is there anything else you'd like to add?
You mean about since?
Just whatever, as sort of a...
Well, let me just tell you that I've retired 5 times.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I've retired 5 times, and then everybody keeps on coming and asking me if I'll do another job, and I always say yes. And my retirement jobs, I have been very careful to try to avoid the taking on jobs that were in the welfare field, because I felt I wanted to do things that I wasn't too closely identified with earlier. The only one that I've taken on as a retirement job that was close to the field was when I undertook to reorganize the volunteer center, and I was there for 15, I don't know how many months. I didn't get nearly the same satisfaction out of that job, or the same feeling of movement in that I did in others, and I think it's because it was in my own field, and I was perhaps disillusioned about what was happening in volunteer centers as a whole across Canada. I don't think that I think they could have been the most dynamic organization in all of metropolitan Toronto. I don't think they have been. Then I went up to the Girl Guides, and that was a fascinating experience. And I was up there for 15 months. And I found that a fascinating group to work with, because their whole concept of services to girls was different than anything I'd been involved with before. But then after that, I have for the last 6 years been working on different boards for the provincial government in the health field. And I had never before worked with the medical profession, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. Every single minute. I worked with first of all, for the optometrists for 6 years, and I found them really a great group to work along with. They have gone through their struggles getting themselves established in the medical field with a lot of what shall I say, difficulty working out the relationship with the medical association. And for the last 4 years, I've been working with the podiatrists. And in that, it's been fascinating because they're having this interesting development of community colleges putting on courses for chiropodists. Now, I never knew the difference between a chiropodist and a podiatrist till I got working on this board. I now know it. As I said to somebody, I certainly have gone from head to foot in this field. But you begin to realize that in many ways the social work profession, with all its weaknesses and its shortcomings, doesn't have the same kind of, what shall I say, competition and infighting within the profession and related bodies. I mean, I don't think of any other body that social workers are going to get involved with. At times there was a little something with the psychologists and the psychiatrists and social workers. I don't think that ever amounted to anything really very serious. But I don't think that we'd have anything comparable to the medical profession not prepared to accept optometrists as a full member of the professional team. I don't think we'd ever have had the same infighting between a chiropodist and a podiatrist. A podiatrist has a degree course, and of course they all got their training in the United States. Chiropodists are British trained, and it's not a degree course.
I had said that would be the last question, but something you just said leads me to ask just one more, if I might. You mentioned the weaknesses of the profession. Would you talk for a minute about what are your views about the weaknesses and the strengths of social work as a profession?
I think the weaknesses of the social work profession is that we haven't really quite accepted ourselves as a profession at all times. In other words, you take this question of registration, control of title, which is an issue that should have been solved many, many years ago, and we're still struggling with it. I think there is one province, isn't there, that has registration, licensing. Alberta, yeah. I think the weakness of the profession, if it has any, is a lack of complete conviction about the role of the profession in the community. I don't think that everybody agrees on what the social worker ought to be doing. I think the strengths of the profession is that I don't think there's ever been any quarrel within the profession about what our duty is to the community and to our clients.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for all the marvelous information that you shared with us this afternoon. I think that this is going to be a great contribution to helping people understand how the profession has developed over the years. And I appreciate the time and energy that you put together to do
My
this.
pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Now, this is an illuminated address that was presented to me when I retired from the Social Planning Council of Metropolitan Toronto.
Once is three.
No, it's okay.
It's
You
okay.
wanna go ahead and describe that?
Yeah, this
Okay.
is just to certify that I have been awarded a Centennial Medal from the Confederation of Canada. A certificate from the Ontario Association of Professional Social Workers in recognition of the years I was president. This is a life membership from the Ontario Association of Professional Social Workers. This is a life membership in the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Ontario Association of Professional Social Worker in recognition of the years that I served both groups.